When I think back to games that really impacted my life, there are only a few that come to mind. Obvious choices like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Final Fantasy VII shouldn't really surprise you considering their accolades and legacies. But a game that I regard in the same way is the first Dark Souls. Now I'm going to be honest with you, I wrote and recorded a whole different script for this video, but after going back and playing Dark Souls on my Switch to gather gameplay footage, I realized that there were just so many more things in this game that I needed to talk about. Before we get too deep into it, I want to mention that this video is about as spoiler-free as I could possibly make it. I'm only showing footage from my first roughly 10 hours of gameplay, as my intention here is to allow you to experience the game the right way for the first time if you've never played it before. Sometimes when I have to go get footage for a video of a game I'm discussing, it feels like a bit of a chore. That wasn't at all the case with Dark Souls. Instead, I found myself well on pace to likely beating the game for a 5th time. This time with a completely different build than I've ever used before. I really wasn't anticipating getting hooked on the game again, but here I am. Roughly 10 years have passed since playing the game for the first time, but this game somehow still manages to capture that same feeling I initially had. So when I first got Dark Souls back in 2014, I had almost no idea what to expect. Before the days of Game Pass, there was something called Xbox Live Gold. Basically, this was just a monthly subscription required to play games on Xbox Online. But similar to PlayStation Plus, it came with a new free game every month. Now, since they only gave you one game every month, Microsoft was actually able to ensure that it was a good game. Quality over quantity. I remember always looking forward to finding out what new game would be free with my subscription, rather than something like the current PlayStation Plus Essential, which more often than not gives you a couple of mediocre titles every month. Anyways, 16-year-old me was not prepared for Dark Souls. The only thing I really knew about Dark Souls before actually starting to play it was that it's notorious for being extremely difficult. And I think this reputation of being extremely difficult that all Soulsborne games have garnered is pretty unfair. You see, these games are definitely difficult at first, but for the most part they are completely fair. This is why once people get good at the game, they no longer find it super tough. If you die in Dark Souls, it's simply because you fucked up. The controls are super tight and responsive, and if you take the time to learn an enemy's patterns, you'll be able to dodge or parry when needed and you won't have nearly as much trouble with the game. And it's kind of like riding a bike. Once you learn the mechanics and get the timing down, you never really lose it. I'm 5 bosses through on my current playthrough, and I've beaten all except for one on my first try. Now there is the occasional cheesy boss that will require multiple attempts, but the game gives you checkpoints in the form of bonfires that are often pretty close to the boss, making it less stressful. And like any good RPG, if you absolutely cannot beat the boss, you can just grind to level up stats until it is doable. These days I can take down most of the bosses in this game quite easily, but my first time playing it was a different story. The cool thing about this is Dark Souls has a pretty unique and useful online mode. It's pretty much the same as Elden Ring's if you've ever played that. You can summon friends or random players to your world by using a humanity and then activating a summoning sign. And if you run out of humanity, all you have to do is place a sign down and join someone else's world, and you'll receive one upon completing a boss. Luckily, when I was in high school playing this game for the first time, a few of my friends were playing too. While it made for less of a pure sweaty experience, taking down bosses with 3 people is much easier. I'm not gonna lie, my first time beating the game was about 80% multiplayer. But I've revisited this game solo so many times since then. I knew servers were still up on consoles, but I didn't actually expect anyone to still be playing this game, especially on the Nintendo Switch like me. But I was pleasantly surprised to see summoning signs down before almost every boss I've reached so far. That's just a testament to how good this game is. People are still playing it all this time later. I mentioned bonfires earlier, but I'll go into a bit more detail because I absolutely love this system, and it's been pretty much the same in every Soulsborne game. How it works is there are bonfires scattered across the open world. These bonfires act as a checkpoint, as in you end up back at the last bonfire you rested at if you do die, but they also act as a hub to level up at. You gain experience points in the form of souls by defeating enemies, and then you use those souls to level up whatever stat you choose. If you happen to die on your way back to the bonfire, you lose all the souls you collected, and only have one chance to go back and retrieve them. If you happen to die again while trying to go pick them up, they're gone for good. This system might seem a bit cruel and unforgiving, but it helps give Dark Souls its unique identity and allows for a lot of freedom in the way you want to play. In almost any game like this, I like to wear heavy armor and use some sort of massive two-handed weapon. During this current playthrough though, I decided to try out playing as a light armor wearing pyromancer, and my experience with the game has definitely felt very different so far. I believe there are serious pros and cons to pretty much every build in this game, so you have to figure out what works best for you. One of the things about the first Dark Souls game that I believe isn't talked about enough is the flawless world design. There is no fast travel early on in the game, which may lead to the player feeling like the world isn't really that open, as it can be extremely daunting having to travel from one bonfire to another. If you do your due diligence exploring though, you will find that From Software basically connected the entire world via shortcuts. And these shortcuts don't open up until the exact right time. They are often in the form of locked doors or doors that are blocked from the other side, and you don't really think much of them when you first see them. But the developers did such a great job of making sure they open up right when you need them to. Sometimes this means that a bonfire that felt very far away from a boss is actually much closer than he thought. It also means the world is actually much smaller than it feels, but everything is just so well connected that it always feels massive. Though I believe Dark Souls 2 is a much better game than most people give it credit for, it definitely was lacking this expert world design, and I think that's one of the main reasons it gets so much hate. The massive feeling open world is just a small part of the wonderful dark and gloomy atmosphere carried throughout this whole game. Another underappreciated aspect of Dark Souls is the amazing soundtrack. Over the years, some games have become defined by their iconic soundtracks. When you hear certain melodies such as the battle theme in Pokemon or the first few notes of the Super Mario Bros. Theme song, you immediately recognize the game that it came from. As a musician myself who absolutely loves when a game has a strong soundtrack, I do really like this, but I find it even more impressive when a game has a beautiful soundtrack that isn't at its forefront. While the music in Dark Souls is phenomenal at all times, it doesn't take your attention away from the game being played. Instead, it elevates the mood and enhances the user's experience. The music is always tasteful and never feels like it's trying too hard, and I really appreciate how hard the composers must have worked to achieve this. Boss fights are a staple in just about every good RPG, and while some games do it much better than others, there is no company that does it better than From Software. If I had to pick just one thing I like the most about Dark Souls, it would be these bosses. The word epic doesn't even begin to describe them. All of the bosses are extremely memorable and unique, both in the way that they attack and their appearances. Almost every boss on this game has some sort of curveball that makes it incredibly challenging to defeat, but extremely satisfying once completed. That curveball could be a much tougher second phase halfway through the battle, or it could be an attack that kills you in one shot if you don't dodge it. You never really know what you're getting into, and there's nothing quite like the feeling of accidentally walking into a boss fight while having a bunch of souls on you. Now, if I could recommend one thing to anyone playing this game for the first time and struggling to beat a boss, it would be to have patience and keep trying. Like most good things in life, it takes time to beat the bosses in this game, because you have to learn how to beat the boss, and the only way to learn is through defeat, over and over again. If you ask any Soulsborne vet how many attempts it took them to beat a hard boss, let's just say around 10 is probably on the small side. I know there's a specific boss in the From Software game Sekiro that took me well over 50 tries. While none of the bosses in the base game Dark Souls really stumped me, all of the bosses in the Artorias of the Abyss DLC did, as they are significantly more difficult and definitely not for the faint of heart. One of the many great things about this game is any of the remastered versions, which is likely the only version you would be purchasing today, include the full DLC, making it well worth the price. And as previously mentioned, if you get really stuck, you can always just summon a friend for help. Dark Souls is a timeless masterpiece. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's perfect, but it's a lot closer to that than most games I've played. Sure, there are definitely janky moments like your weapon occasionally smacking on the walls when you try to attack an enemy, or going down a long ladder and taking absolutely forever. But overall, no matter which version you play, Dark Souls is still just a great video game. I truly believe that this game helped shape me into the perseverant and persistent person that I am today. And with Dark Souls being available on both older consoles and pretty much every modern console, and not being crazy expensive, there is absolutely no reason not to go back and try it out. With all of the modern games out there, in most cases I'd still rather just go back and play a Soulsborne game. And if it's your first time trying out a game from this series, why not make it the game that really brought it to the mainstream? I also have to commend From Software for doing a good job keeping their games up to date, and in my opinion, the Dark Souls trilogy definitely still holds up. If you've played Elden Ring and are looking to scratch that itch a bit before the release of its upcoming Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, I highly recommend going back and playing Dark Souls. I personally love the Nintendo Switch version, as being able to play this game on the go is still pretty surreal to me. And if these games do feel a bit dated to you, the PS5 exclusive remake of Demon's Souls is still one of the best looking games I have ever played, and it's a great alternative. So thank you all for watching this video. Dark Souls and really the whole Soulsborne series means a lot to me, so don't be shocked if you see more videos about these games down the road. If you enjoyed this look back at Dark Souls, please consider subscribing to the channel and like the video. Drop a comment down below letting me know what game I should talk about next. And as always, take care and I'll see you in the next one.